Thank you, Ray. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm the first person at the podium, so I hope the mic is good for today. Thanks again, everyone in the room and those of you online for joining us today. I'm going to be speaking about two recently published guidances today, the draft guidance on the Indications and Usage section of labeling and the draft guidance on the Drug Abuse and Dependence section of labeling. This is the same disclaimer Eric had up. I won't be reading it to you. Our objectives for this morning's talk are first to describe the recommendations for prescription drug labeling outlined in these two draft guidances, and for you to be able to identify labeling information discussed today that's relevant for your particular organization. First, I'm going to be speaking about the Indications and Usage draft guidance. Now, certainly this guidance of the two I'm talking about is the most broadly applicable. Every drug has an indication section, whereas the second topic is kind of a subset of our prescription drugs. So let's start with what is the role of the Indications and Usage section. And if you really think about it, it's to enable healthcare practitioners to be able to identify easily appropriate therapies for their individual patients by clearly communicating what the drug's indications are. All indications should be clear, concise, useful and informative, and whenever possible, consistent within and across drug and therapeutic classes. It's important, though, to start with a little bit of thinking about the scope of the indication and how that falls out relative to the population studied. So let me explain a little bit. Oops. I think I lost this. Okay, so when you think about our indications and the scope, it's very important that practitioners reading indication section understand the patient population to whom the indication applies. And so for most drugs, the indication is really reflective of the population studied, and it mirrors that population. But there are times at which FDA comes to the determination that the indication can vary a little bit from the population studied. And so I'll go through a few of those examples. So sometimes populations can be broader in scope than the studied population. And this is something that can be considered when you think about these major factors. And these include the generalizability of the evidence, consistencies in the disease process across different patient groups, and the drug's overall benefits and risks. So when thinking about how you're going to write the indication and how broad or narrow, or if it should mirror the studied population, these are some of the factors that you would consider. So I know it sounds kind of strange to say that indications can sometimes be broader than the population that were studied, but if you think about it, this is something that is actually done fairly commonly, and we don't even really think about it in that way. So lots of times indications cover populations that were absent or were specifically excluded from the clinical studies supporting approval. And these can be groups such as geriatric patients, pregnant women, patients taking certain concomitant drugs, or patients with a different severity or stage of a disease. So these can sometimes be intentional or just happenstance about your studied enrolled population. So let me walk you through an example of this. Let's say a study in adults was performed that enrolled patients of a certain age range and excluded patients taking certain concomitant drugs. So when I say enrolled patients of a certain age range, it's a study in adults that just through the randomization and enrollment process, maybe you had adults aged 34 to 59. You know, that wasn't your intention, that's not your inclusion-exclusion criteria, but that's what you ended up with. And the study showed that, and there's no other available evidence suggesting that the drug would be unsafe or ineffective in adults outside that age range or in those taking the other drug. So when these scenarios happen, the indication would typically be worded to reflect that broader age group, where the indication would be in adults rather than the exact ages studied. It would be kind of preposterous for the indication to say this is approved in adults aged 29 to 57. You know, it's broadly for adults. And likewise, unless available evidence suggests otherwise, the indication would not exclude patients taking that concomitant drug unless there was a reason to do so. Now, conversely, sometimes there's a determination that the indication should be narrower in scope than the studied population. So in this example, a study enrolled and randomized patients, but then also stratified participants by the presence or absence of a specific genomic marker. Results of the study showed that benefit really only existed in patients who had tested positive for the marker. So in this kind of circumstance, FDA may conclude that the available evidence supports approval of an indication in a population narrower than in scope than the population that was studied. There's a little delay here on this clicker. So let's take a minute to think about how we think about pediatric populations and indications. So when I talk about how sometimes broadening populations based on age is something that's acceptable, typically this is not something that's appropriate across pediatric populations or even between adult and pediatric populations for a couple of reasons. Click. Okay. Certainly we have some statutory requirements related to pediatric assessments. And obviously, there's some unique clinical considerations for pediatric patients. Those are things such as differences in drug metabolism and different safety risks. So for these reasons, between where I talked about the adult age populations and the pediatric age populations, the guidance recommends that indications should state that a drug is approved, for example, in adults, if that's what the data supports, or in pediatric patients X years of age and older, or in adults and pediatric patients X years of older. So the guidance recommends that all indications include the age groups of the indicated population. These are example statements. These are not the only way you can word it. There are obviously different ways to present that, but the guidance recommends age groups. So turning now to the content and the format of the indication section. This section includes really two components, the indication itself and, if appropriate, any identified limitations of use. And I'll be talking about limitations of use specifically in a few minutes. So let's think about what details we want to include in our indications. So for many drugs, in fact, probably, I won't say the majority, but very frequently the indication will be sufficiently conveyed by stating the disease or condition being treated, prevented, mitigated, cured, or diagnosed, and the appropriate age groups. So in these kinds of circumstances, any endpoints and descriptions of benefit would be summarized in the clinical studies section of labeling and would not be part of the indication. However, there are other scenarios that may warrant the inclusion of more information in the indication, more information beyond the disease and the age group. And here are a few examples. So there are times where a drug may target specific or different aspects of a disease, such as drugs for multiple sclerosis, or when endpoints are not well established, such as in patients with heart failure. In scenarios like this, the specific benefits of the drug would be stated within the indication. And let's go through a few examples like that. So if a drug is indicated for the treatment of insomnia, the indication should state whether the drug affects sleep onset, sleep maintenance, or both, in order to facilitate appropriate prescribing for an individual patient, rather than just merely saying that the drug is approved for the treatment of insomnia. Likewise, for many outcome studies, when there's an overall effect on a composite endpoint, the indication typically identifies the component of the composite, and this is done very commonly in things like cardiovascular outcome trials, where a composite endpoint could be made up of cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, and stroke. Now, per the regulations, indications must include the following elements after you say drug X, the name of the drug, is indicated. It must include the disease, condition, or manifestation of that disease or condition, such as symptoms, being treated, prevented, mitigated, cured, or diagnosed. And when applicable, the regulations say there is other information that can be required to describe the approved indication. And some examples of these are selected patient subgroups. So in this mock indication, drug X is indicated for the treatment of, and there you see the age groups in green, adult and pediatric patients 12 years of age and older. With moderate to severe in red, you see the disease severity, plaque psoriasis, who are candidates for phototherapy or systemic therapy. And that last snippet in purple is, again, narrowing down the population to whom the indication is applicable. Likewise, if there are adjunctive or concomitant therapies, that should be included in the indication, such as drug X is indicated in adults for the treatment of high-grade malignant glioma as an adjunct to surgery and radiation in red. Another example is when there are specific tests needed for proper patient selection. So in this example, drug X is indicated for the treatment of adult patients with metastatic non-small cell lung cancer whose tumors are ALK positive as detected by an FDA-approved test. So those are examples of where the indication includes more information beyond just the specific disease being treated and the age group. So remember, I said there were two components to the indications and usage section typically, the indication itself and limitations of use. So let me spend a little bit of time explaining when limitations of use would be included. And these examples include when the evidence falls short of requiring a contraindication but suggests that use of the drug may be inadvisable. When there's sufficient uncertainty about the drug's benefits in certain clinical situations to suggest the drug should generally not be used in those settings. And when the awareness of such information is important for practitioners to ensure the safe and effective use of the drug. And this is really kind of one of the most important pieces. It's limitations of use should be included when this information that you're trying to convey is so important that practitioners need to consider it when they're making risk-benefit prescribing decisions. So let's talk a little bit more about these examples. So when there's a reasonable concern or uncertainty in a certain situation, an example here is an indication that says drug X is indicated for the treatment of hypertension in adults and pediatric patients 1 year of age and older. This drug has a limitation of use. In patients younger than 1 year of age, drug X can adversely affect kidney development. And then the labeling would include a cross-reference to other sections of labeling that explain that with the warning and precaution and the use in specific population subsection. Another example where a limitation of use may be appropriate is for drugs with dose, duration, or long-term use considerations. So in this example, drug X is indicated for the treatment of severe spasticity in adult patients with spinal cord injury, brain injury, or multiple sclerosis. A limitation was included prior to implantation of a device for chronic intrathecal infusion of drug X, confirm a positive clinical response to drug X in a screening phase. So in this example, it was determined that this information was so important, knowing that before you're going to go the very invasive step of an intrathecal implant, that you need to do this kind of screening phase to see if the patient will respond to the drug. So limitations of use don't appear for most drugs. So most drugs don't have them, and so all of those situations I outlined are where you might consider having one. So limitations per the guidance should not be used to restate information already included in the indication, such as if an indication is clearly worded and well written for use in combination with another drug, there's no need for a limitation of use stating that the subject drug should be used only in combination and not as monotherapy. Likewise, limitations should not be used to address an absence of data in populations in which the drug wasn't studied, such as if a drug is approved to reduce the risk of rejection in patients receiving a heart transplant, there should not be a limitation of use about the lack of data on use in lung transplants. So as you can imagine, every drug is going to have a million unstudied populations, and it makes no sense to have limitations about every possible unstudied population unless there's a reason to think that that's a specific concern. So turning now to the formatting issues. When you have multiple indications for a drug, there are a couple different ways that you can approach that when you're writing the indication section. First, you could assign a subsection to each indication, where in section 1, 1.1 is the indication for disease A, and 1.2 would be disease B. Or you can present distinct indications using bullets under Section 1, the indications and usage, where drug X is indicated for, and then bullet out each individual indication. When you're doing your limitations of use, there are a couple different ways, again, to format them. They're typically presented separately from the indication under a subheading using the term limitations of use. And they're typically not under a separate numbered subsection. But there are times when that might make the most sense. So in that scenario, if a drug has multiple indications and the limitations of use apply to all of those indications, it may be preferable to use a separate numbered subsection for the limitation of use rather than repeating the identical limitation of use to accompany each of the individual indications. So now I'm going to turn to our second topic here, which is the draft guidance on the drug abuse and dependence section of labeling. Now, this guidance was published in July of this year. And again, it's unlike the indications and usage guidance, which applies to virtually all of our labeling. This one applies to those that have information on drug abuse and dependence in their labeling. So I'm going to use the acronym, the DAD guidance for drug abuse and dependence, because it's too wordy for my slides. So let's think about what products this guidance would apply to. Certainly what comes to mind is those prescription drugs that are controlled under the Controlled Substances Act, CSA. But also there are certain prescription drugs that are not controlled substances for which there might be important information to convey to healthcare providers related to abuse and dependence. And I'll explain what that means. That may strike you as a little bit odd, but we'll go through that as well. So let's talk first about distribution of information. And you may hear this repeatedly today about the use of cross-referencing in labeling. And when one specific topic, Eric talked about renal impairment, how information about renal impairment can show up in multiple places in labeling. It may be how to dose in renal impairment. It may be a warning and precaution. There may be pharmacokinetic information. There's maybe a use in specific populations. So let's talk a little bit about distributing information related to drug abuse and dependence. So, as you would expect, the detailed information about drug abuse and dependence would be found in the DAD section. And other relevant sections should discuss only those aspects of that information that are pertinent to those sections' scopes and purposes. So clearly, you don't want to repeat identical content word for word, cut and paste paragraphs in multiple sections of labeling. You want to wisely use cross-referencing, summarize in one section, cross-reference to another section where more detail is provided. So the drug abuse and dependence information, again, is a scenario where oftentimes we find information in multiple sections of labeling. So for example, many times products have abuse and dependence information both in the warnings and precautions and the DAD section. So in this scenario, the drug abuse and dependence section will have the detailed abuse or dependence information located there, and these can include what I'm going to be talking about later, things such as descriptions of study designs, results of abuse liability studies, and all of the other information in those specific subsections. Whereas the warnings and precautions section will have a more succinct description of the specific adverse reaction or risk, and will identify what the clinical implications are of that risk and any recommendations for managing those risks related to abuse and dependence. And again, we discourage identical information throughout labeling. So let's drill down a little bit into this section specifically. Now, per our regulations, the drug abuse and dependence section is comprised of 3 subsections: 9.1, controlled substance, 9.2, abuse, and 9.3, dependence. So let's go through each of these one by one. So the controlled substance section comes first. So per our labeling regulations in 201.57, if a drug is scheduled under the Controlled Substance Act, this subsection must state that the drug is a controlled substance and identify the schedule under which the drug is controlled. The guidance explains that it should identify the proprietary name, if indeed there is one, and the active ingredient or ingredients or substances that are controlled. So let's go through a couple of examples of how this subsection can read. So our typical presentation for a branded drug would be drug X contains, and then there you insert the non-proprietary name, comma, a Schedule II controlled substance. So this is our typical presentation for a branded drug. If you have an A&D product or a product without a proprietary name, the guidance recommends presenting it this way. Active ingredient Y is a Schedule II controlled substance. And lastly, there is kind of a third scenario that happens rarely, but it does happen at times, when the drug is approved, the approval letter is sent, the labeling is posted on drugs at FDA, but the drug is not yet marketed because scheduling is still pending. So labeling is available, but the drug is not marketed because it hasn't been scheduled yet. So in these scenarios, which, as I said, is not terribly common but does exist, the guidance explains that that 9.1 section would read, drug Z contains active ingredient Z, and then in parentheses, controlled substance schedule to be determined after review by the DEA. Now, I mentioned that there are times when information about abuse and dependence for non-scheduled drugs would appear in Section 9. So let me give you a few examples of that, and I think you'll see where I'm going with this. So if there is a drug with a demonstrated lack of abuse potential for a new drug in a therapeutic category in which most other products are controlled substances, that may be relevant information to include in Section 9.2 to let practitioners know that, well, every other drug approved for whatever the indication may be, this one is a little bit different. Or another example may be for 9.3, when a non-controlled drug may include information on physical dependence, when discontinuation of that drug has been shown to cause a withdrawal syndrome. So these are examples of when non-controlled drugs have information that's relevant for the drug abuse and dependence section. So what do we do in those situations? The guidance recommends that in those circumstances, even though the drug is not controlled, you still include a 9.1 if you will be including a 9.2 and or a 9.3. So the guidance says to include a subsection 9.1 with a single sentence stating that the active ingredient or substance is not controlled, such as drug X contains active ingredient, which is not a controlled substance. Again, if it does not have a proprietary name, it would read active ingredient Y is not a controlled substance. So for drugs that have information in 9.2 or 9.3 that are not controlled, we still would include a 9.1. Now this is granted, this is a very small subset of non-controlled drugs, but it was something that comes up often enough that it was important to include in the draft guidance. So let's talk a little bit about terminology. Maybe these words are a little bit hard to read, but there's a lot of terminology that floats around in the medical community, in the lay community, on TV, on the news, in the newspaper, everywhere where we're talking about drug abuse and dependence related information. And these are things like misuse, abuse, withdrawal, addiction, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about what these terms really mean, where they overlap, which ones are synonyms, and what their distinct definitions may be. So as we were drafting this guidance, we really wrestled a lot with a lot of terminology issues. So because of this, and the confusion and misunderstanding about some of these terminology issues, the guidance really narrowed down the 5 major concepts among all of those things that float around for the drug abuse and dependence section. And these are abuse, misuse, addiction, physical dependence, and tolerance. And so we'll kind of break these down for you. And one thing we found when we were drafting the guidance is that there's even confusion within some of our labeling about where do those topics fall in labeling. So among those 5 kind of big major topics, what goes where in Section 9? So with Section 9.2 being abuse, these are the 3 kind of constructs or concepts that should be covered in 9.2. Clearly, abuse is one of them. Also misuse and addiction. And likewise, section 9.3, the dependence subsection, would cover the topics of physical dependence and tolerance. And those are grouped together that way because they're interrelated terms, whereas abuse, misuse, and addiction kind of go together and have some interrelationships. They are distinct from physical dependence and tolerance, which are really physiological phenomenon. So that's why they were grouped that way in the guidance. So as I mentioned, these terms are commonly confused, misinterpreted, and so for that reason, the guidance recommends that when you have information about any of those 5 concepts in your section 9, that the definitions of those individual terms be included in the DAD section. And this is to help ensure a common understanding of what these terms mean, and also to help providers facilitate diagnosis and management of substance use disorders, excuse me. So let's talk about 9.2, the abuse subsection, and how that would be structured. So as I mentioned, 9.2 contains information related to these 3 topics, abuse, misuse, and addiction, that is important for prescribers to consider. The regulations state that 9.2 must state the types of abuse that can occur with the drug and any adverse reactions pertinent to them, and must identify any particularly susceptible patient populations if that information is known. This subsection should also summarize information that supports the recommendations on how to prevent or mitigate any of the risks associated with abuse. Whoa. It should include risks specific to abuse of the product, such as those related to a product's particular formulation. So if those are things like the risks from crushing or chewing or injecting that are related to the formulation. And the subsection may include information on risks resulting from inappropriate routes or methods of administration. The guidance goes on to explain that 9.2 information should summarize results from human abuse potential studies that adequately characterize the abuse potential of the drug product that is appropriate for the prescriber, and should summarize any studies conducted to evaluate the abuse deterrent properties of a drug product. Again, a smaller subset of our approved drugs. So again, if 9.2 includes a discussion of the risk of abuse with the product, the guidance recommends the following definition be included. Abuse is the intentional non-therapeutic use of a drug, even once, for its desirable psychological or physiological effects. Now, the guidance, when it explains these definitions, says that these are the definitions FDA recommends for the purposes of labeling. We certainly recognize that there are numerous definitions floating out there in the world for all of these terms, but they're based largely on already established definitions, such as those in the DSM, with some of them have a few tweaks to make them more relevant for labeling, but the guidance recommends that this wording be used for abuse. Likewise, if section 9.2 has a discussion of misuse that would negatively impact health or functioning, here's the definition the guidance recommends. Misuse is the intentional use for therapeutic purposes of a drug by an individual in a way other than prescribed by a healthcare provider or for whom it was not prescribed. Now, the guidance has a nice, tidy explanation of the differences between abuse and misuse. And if you kind of look at the 2 definitions and you compare them, it really has to do with the intentionality of the use of the drug, why the person is using it. Is it for therapeutic purposes or non-therapeutic purposes? So if you're still kind of confused about the differences in those 2, I would point you to the guidance because it has a nice explanation of that. And lastly, in terms of definitions, if the drug has a risk of addiction, again, this definition should be included. It is long, but it's still just one sentence. Drug addiction is a cluster of behavioral, cognitive, and physiological phenomena that may include a strong desire to take the drug, difficulties in controlling drug use, such as continuing drug use despite harmful consequences, giving a higher priority to drug use than other activities and obligations, and possible tolerance or physical dependence. So let's turn now to section 9.3, dependence. So per our regulations, this subsection must contain information about the drug related to physical dependence, withdrawal, and tolerance, and must describe characteristic effects resulting from the psychological and physical dependence that occurs with the drug, and must identify, if known, the quantity of drug over a period of time that may lead to tolerance or dependence or both. Now you'll see here in bullet number 1 that only 2 of those terms are highlighted in red. Only 2 of those terms are among the 5 that we identified as the major concepts. And you'll see as we go through section 9.3 how withdrawal is kind of subsumed under one of those, so it doesn't get its own separate definition and concept. So the guidance explains that subsection 9.3 should summarize signs and symptoms of withdrawal after chronic use or abuse of the drug, and should summarize information supporting recommendations to healthcare providers on how to prevent or mitigate those risks associated with physical dependence, withdrawal, and tolerance. So for drugs to which patients may develop physical dependence, again, here's the definition the guidance recommends be incorporated. Physical dependence is a state that develops as a result of physiological adaptation in response to repeated drug use, manifested by withdrawal signs and symptoms after abrupt discontinuation or a significant dose reduction of a drug. And again, while these are primarily applicable for controlled substance drugs, there are certain drugs that have physical dependence phenomena that are non-controlled substances. Again, carrying on the definitions, for drugs to which patients may develop tolerance, here's the definition the guidance recommends. Tolerance is a physiological state characterized by a reduced response to a drug after repeated administration, such as a higher dose of a drug is required to produce the same effect that was once obtained at a lower dose. So I'm going to go back one slide because one thing I forgot to mention in the physical dependence definition is that I mentioned that withdrawal didn't get its own specific separate definition, and that's because withdrawal is a manifest. The withdrawal signs are part of the presentation of physical dependence. So you'll see withdrawal is incorporated into the definition of physical dependence. Like many of our guidances, this one includes a what not to include part. So there are some things that the guidance recommends not be included in the drug abuse and dependence section. Some of these are applicable across labeling and not necessarily specific to drug abuse and dependence, such as speculative or promotional language. Certainly we don't want that in other places of labeling as well. The drug abuse and dependence section should not include detailed information on disposal of controlled substances, which typically appears elsewhere in labeling, such as in the patient counseling information section. And this subsection should not include lengthy definitions other than the ones that it recommends, of course, or discussions related to abuse and dependence. So this is really not a place for paragraph after paragraph of textbook type information about abuse, addiction, dependence. The definitions should suffice, and the specific drug-specific information is what you would want in there, rather than a kind of primer on substance abuse. So let's take a minute and go through our 2 very brief challenge questions. So our first one. When compared to the population studied in the main registration trials, an indication may A, exactly match the studied population, B, be broader than the studied population, C, be narrower than the studied population, A and C, meaning exactly match and be narrower but not broader, or E, A, B, and C. Anyone in the room want to shout out where we think we are there? I hear an overwhelming E. Yes, exactly. So as I said in the first part where we're talking about indication sections, while primarily the indication would match the studied population in most circumstances, there are certain circumstances where it may be deemed appropriate to write an indication broader than the studied population or write an indication narrower. And moving now to challenge question number 2. This is a true or false question. For drugs that are not controlled substances, the drug abuse and dependence section should always be omitted from labeling. True or false? False, exactly. So yes, I spent some time explaining about why Section 9 is sometimes included for non-controlled drugs. Now, I don't want you to come away with the sense that most non-controlled drugs will have a Section 9. Most non-controlled drugs do omit Section 9. We have a regulation that says any clearly inapplicable section or subsection should be omitted from labeling. So most non-controlled drugs don't have a Section 9 at all. But for those that do, the guidance outlines how to do that. Okay, with that, I'm going to invite Eric to come on up and join me, and we have ample time for questions. So thank you.
All right, and just as before, if you've got questions for Iris or Eric based on the topics just covered, please come on up to the microphones. First come, first serve, no waiting. But while we're waiting for people to queue up the microphones, let's go ahead and start with our first online question, please.
Sure. Okay, the question is, how do you distinguish a limitation of use versus just stating in the label that the drug is not indicated in a particular situation?
Thank you for the question. If I understand it correctly, it's asking about how to distinguish a limitation of use versus, I'm sorry, can you read it again?
Versus just stating in the label that the drug is not indicated in the particular situation.
Okay. Typically in labeling, the indication section is typically written in the affirmative. It's written about who the drug is indicated for. The limitations of use heading can explain in populations or clinical circumstances in which use of the drug is inadvisable. Typically, labeling doesn't say specifically anywhere in labeling the drug is not indicated for XYZ. There are some exceptions to that. Per regulation, if there's a specific risk or something like a warning or precaution where we know there's a risk related to an unapproved indication, the regulations require us to include that risk, and that's a situation where we'll describe the risk but also clarify that use in that specific indication or population is not indicated. So typically the indications and usage section is not a place to explain where something is not indicated.
All right, and again, if there's any questions here in the room, come on up to and right on cue. Please, nice and close to the microphone for me.
Yes, hi. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about limitations for use in terms of accelerated approval products. You know, often you might have approvals based on response rate in oncology, and I've seen statements, overall survival has not been demonstrated, or the clinical benefit remains to be determined in confirmatory trials. So what is your current kind of advice on those?
That's a good question about accelerated use approval drugs. And there we're really kind of a unique subset of drugs in the way our indications are written. And I would point you to, we have a guidance specifically about how to write accelerated approval indications. And it outlines all the different components of an accelerated approval indication. It's typically multiple sentences, and it includes those components that you mentioned about what has been shown, what has yet to be shown. And it's done a little bit, it's done differently than a typical limitation of use indication. Are we going to have a presentation on accelerated approval, Eric?
Amber's going to discuss it in her presentation later today about transformation of an indication.
Right, so we'll address indications for accelerated approval a little later in the day in a very good case study that we'll be hearing about.
Okay, next online question, please.
What is the reference for the definitions? Where can we find the definitions that you discussed in the presentation? For example, misuse, abuse, and dependence.
Well, as I noted, these definitions were developed with the express purpose for use in labeling. If you look at the guidance itself, I believe it's a footnote explanation, I can't remember exactly, that talks about the origins of the definition and that they are largely based on the DSM definitions. And even within federal government health agencies, you may sometimes see different definitions. Maybe the CDC has some different definitions, or other federal agencies. We're not 100% consistent across our agencies about definitions and things like this. But we strive for the purposes of labeling to be consistent within and across our labels on that. So I would point you to the guidance that gives a little bit of explanation on that.
Okay, and again, any questions in the room? Come on down to the microphones. Otherwise, let's go to the next online question, please.
If agreement on abuse potential and dependence for an NME has not been concurred with the FDA division at the time of NDA submission, how should Section 9 of the draft labels be treated? Can you omit Section 9 since a clear agreement has not been reached?
So I assume the question is with respect to how do you submit labeling, proposed labeling, when one aspect of the labeling is still being developed or potentially not decided. So in the initial submission, the application holder should make their best attempt with respect to incorporating other appropriate information in subsection 9.2, abuse, and subsection 9.3, dependence. With respect to the controlled substance, as implied in the question, that's determined by the DEA later. So obviously that cannot be filled out completely. So part of that information could be left blank. But I would recommend that subsections 9.2 and 9.3 be developed, as certainly right now you have a fantastic draft guidance to guide you.
Okay, looks like the online questions are still coming in. If we've got another one queued up to go, let's read that one.
Does the carton or container require potential information about potential for abuse or dependence or misuse other than the controlled substance schedule symbol, especially those that are more restrictive in Schedule 1 and 2?
I'm not aware, besides the controlled substance requirement, of including specific requirements about including abuse information on carton container labeling. However, we can include warnings or cautionary statements, and that can potentially include additional information, recognizing carton labeling and especially container labeling have limitations. And we have some recommendations with respect to what to include on our draft guidance, safety considerations with respect to medication errors with carton container labeling. And we have a fantastic talk tomorrow afternoon about the global subject about reducing and minimizing medication errors with carton container labeling.
Okay, and I didn't mean to scare anybody off earlier. You really won't have to buy lunch for somebody if you come up and ask any questions. So if there are any questions in the room, please come on up, but let's take our next online question, please.
How does FDA coordinate with industry to update PIs for non-scheduled drugs which would be classified as scheduled by the DEA?
Do we have that one
Do you
again
mind
a little
rereading?
slower?
How does the FDA coordinate with industry to update the PI for a non-scheduled drug, which would be classified as scheduled by the DEA?
So as Iris mentioned in her talk, one would develop, when the product is approved, one would develop subsection 9.1, including that statement that the schedule will be determined later. Deborah Bites will also talk about the implications for the product title and the initial use approval, about how to develop labeling when the controlled substance is pending. So in 3 areas of the labeling, the product title, initial use approval, and subsection 9.1, information will be pending. However, after the DEA does do the scheduling, the application holder must submit new labeling, and that information is updated to the scheduling.
And I think the question may also be, the questioner may also be interested in the rare scenario in which a drug has been marketed for many years as a non-controlled substance, and then there's a decision as more information becomes known about the risks and benefits of the drug, there's a decision subsequently to schedule it. Now, that has happened. It doesn't happen very often. But in those circumstances, certainly there would be a lot of back and forth and discussion with the applicant or applicants for that active ingredient product to develop the controlled substance labeling for that product.
Okay, we got another online question back there.
Sure. Can you speak a bit more on broad versus narrow labeling? For example, when might an indication specify mild, moderate, or severe disease versus the broader disease?
That's a really good question, and that's something that was discussed a lot as the guidance was developed, and in any venue where I talk about the indications guidance, this is something that it's really this broad versus narrow kind of scope thing that people seem very interested in. And this document represents kind of the first time that we've really discussed it, even though, as I mentioned, there are lots of times where we just kind of inherently broaden our indications beyond the populations that are studied. And it's really still very much a case-by-case decision. It's FDA's determination based on their thorough review and discussion of all the available evidence, really determining the population to whom the determination of substantial evidence applies. So I mentioned three of the main factors that are considered there, kind of the generalizability of the evidence. You know, even though it may have been studied in this group, are we comfortable with this evidence applying to a larger group? The consistencies in the disease process, kind of the pathophysiology and development of the disease, and that's kind of where the mild, moderate, severe kind of thing might come in. And certainly the relative toxicities of a drug. If a drug is highly toxic and has a very concerning safety profile, it would not be surprising that there might be more hesitancy to widen an indication beyond the population that it was studied in, versus a drug that has a fairly benign safety profile. There may be a little bit more of a comfort level there. There are times where if the drug is studied only in sicker patients, for lack of a better word, it may be studied only in moderate to severe or only in severe patients. So again, and then there can be a discussion about should the drug be approved for the entire population with that condition or disease. And sometimes the answer is no, and sometimes the answer is yes. It's very much case by case. So, you know, this guidance is not necessarily giving a green light to everybody to willy-nilly, you know, propose broadening their indications and go crazy. You know, this is something that FDA spends a lot of time and very carefully considering. But it's something that, you know, we encourage companies to discuss what the scope of their indication may be early in the process to get the best information kind of shared back and forth and have some mutual understanding there. But again, it's a very challenging aspect of writing an indication is certainly the broadness or narrowness of the scope. I don't know, Eric, if you have anything to add.
Oh, that was a great answer.
Spot, sorry.
All right, let's go ahead. If we've got it, let's just do one more online question before we go to break.
Sure, we have one more. In regards to the specific test needed for proper patient selection stated in the indication, is it expected that this information will be repeated in section 2.2, patient selection 2?
So, with respect to distribution of information in sections 1, indications and usage, and section 2, I think the question is referring to. So, in some labeling, particularly in the oncology setting, there is a section in subsection 2, patient selection, that can provide additional details about the indicated population, particularly if there are some required testing that must be done for selection of the population. In subsection, typically it's subsection 2.1, patient selection. One refers the reader to the CDRH, the device center's website about in vitro diagnostic devices, where you could learn additional information about the required testing that must be done.
All right, and with that, please help me thank Iris and Eric for sharing their insights with us.